Ready? All right, well, welcome everybody. I hope everybody's here for running Windows off of a USB drive. We're excited to have this session. The team's been working on this project for a while, and we haven't really been able to talk about it, so we're super excited to be able to share this with you today. So I'm Steve Silverberg, and my team built this technology. We worked across Windows with a lot of other teams, and I've got Arvind, our dev lead, and Troy, one of the other program managers, who will be with me to answer questions at the end. Just to quickly go through what we'll be covering. We'll talk about the whole Windows to Go. Why did we develop this? What scenarios do we think this is really suitable for? We'll go through some of the technology in depth. What did we have to do to make this work, and how does it work in practice? We'll talk about some of the partner opportunities, because this is a fundamentally new scenario for USB drives, and it requires a new type of drive to meet the performance and reliability requirements. And then you'll leave really understanding how this can be used. You'll understand the new opportunities, and something special, you'll actually leave with a Windows to Go drive. So at the very end of the session, we will, after we go through questions and answers, we'll leave a little bit of time, and then as people file out, they'll get a drive from Arvind and Troy, who will be at the door. We thought about throwing a couple drives out. All right. So what is Windows to Go? So really, and this is a message that we really want to stress, probably one of the reasons we were tucked into a small room, is that this really is targeted at enterprises. And the idea is that what Windows to Go allows is it allows an enterprise to take a managed enterprise image, put it on a USB drive, and run it on an unmanaged host. And this is important because we looked at various different ways that we could have provided this technology through virtualization or other means. But what this really allows us to do is take a managed desktop, a full Windows managed desktop, and run it on an unmanaged host with no software installation, no worry about what's on that host. As long as that host can run Windows, it can run Windows to Go. So let's talk about, from a big picture, the workflow and how this actually works. So you take Windows. Again, this is full Windows. We're not talking about a special version of Windows. This is Windows 8. You provision it just like you would provision a laptop. So the same imaging tools, and I'll talk about that more in more detail as we go, but the same tools that you would use to provision a laptop or a desktop will work with Windows to Go. You put it on the drive, you deploy the drive. So for instance, what we did with the drives that you'll get today, we created a master image, which is the same image that's on the Samsung devices that you received. We provisioned a drive, and then we used a duplicator to duplicate 500 drives. So that's how we did it. Now, inside an organization, there's various ways you might want to do that, whether it's on demand by an individual user or using tools like SCCM or homegrown tools. But essentially, you deploy it the same way that you would deploy a laptop. Then the user can use it both inside the organization. They can take it home. We'll walk through the various scenarios that it can be used. You can roam to multiple machines. And then from the perspective of how it's activated, you would use volume activation through KMS server or Active Directory. So let me give you a quick demo. We have a couple demos. The first one I'll show you is essentially we're running on a ASUS laptop here. I've got 3 different laptops that I'm going to show you. And what I want to just first show you is that Windows to Go can take full advantage of the hardware. So I've got a bunch of things running here. I've got some modern applications, some Metro applications. I've got Visual Studio. I've got an Excel spreadsheet. And as you can see, it's pretty snappy. And in fact, one thing that's important to note, when I talk about the hardware and the fact that we want USB 3.0 drives, I'm actually running over a USB 2.0 port. So this machine does not have a USB 3.0 port, and it's still running very fast. In fact, be very hard-pressed to know that you're not running off the native hard drive. So one of the things that I want to do for this first demo, because I'm going to show roaming, is I'm going to, I've got a Word document here, and at the beginning of the session, I talked to a gentleman down here whose name is Carl, and Carl and I have never met before this session, so I'm going to save this document, and this document is on the desktop, as you can see. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to shut this machine down, and I'm going to take the USB drive. I'm going to power down here, shut down, and I'm going to take this drive. I'm using on this machine, I'm actually using a Super Talent drive, and this is an 8-channel Super Talent drive. It's the fastest drive that we found on the market today, and this drive is actually available. So while we're talking about new drives and a new class of drives, there are some drives available today, and this is a pretty cool looking drive. I'm going to take this and I'm going to boot up on this Lenovo laptop. This is actually a tablet, and while I'm doing that, and the boot up is pretty fast, but I'm going to go ahead and switch over to another machine that I've got. And on this machine, what I wanted to point out here is the experience from a user's perspective. So it's just Windows, but on the right-hand side here, you can see on the computer my local drive, which says C. I only see one drive, even though there's a hard drive on this machine. You can see this is a 30 gigabyte drive. I'm actually using a different drive, a Kingston drive on this machine. And so the user has the experience that they're just seeing the native drive they're booted off of, which in this case is a Windows to Go workspace. What's actually happening is, if you look on the left and you see Disk Manager, you can actually see the host hard drive here, and this is a 119 gig drive, but it's been offlined. And it's been offlined so that the user, the experience is that I'm not accidentally moving files between the Windows to Go drive and the host drive. I want to keep them separate. And in fact, if you took a Windows to Go drive and plugged it into a running machine, you would not see that drive either, though if you brought up Disk Manager, you would. We don't assign a drive letter. And really, this isn't meant to be a hardcore security feature. It's really meant around data leakage so that things stay the same. Like you could imagine taking those Samsung devices that you've been given, say it's your personal device, you bring it into work, you boot off of your corporate image, off of a Windows to Go workspace. You use it just like you would use a machine at work. At the end of the day, you take it out, you boot back, and now you're back to your the personal experience that you have. There's nothing left behind. There's no chance that corporate data is leaking onto your personal machine, and of course, the same thing applies. So let me walk over. It didn't actually take nearly that long to boot the machine, but I wanted to show that. So this is, as I said, a Lenovo tablet, and this machine actually has touch. And so one of the things that we'll be talking about is that with Windows to Go, you actually get to experience the full set of hardware resources that are available to you. So the machine, the Asus machine did not have touch, did not have a camera, but this one does, and I can go up and I can change the picture and do the same demo that you've seen a million times, and just like everybody else, I look horrible on the webcam, so I'll get rid of that. So again, I get the full use of this machine. If I go to the desktop, this is the same desktop that I had. I'll bring up this Word document here, and you'll see that it's the same Word document that we were using on the other machine. So there's Carl's name. So again, what we just showed here was the ability to use Windows to Go just like a normal desktop. There really isn't any difference. You can roam to multiple machines. You get that same great experience. So if you've got a desktop machine at work and a laptop at home, you're on a trip, with your spouse, you have only one machine, you could share that machine and you could get all of the benefits of whatever resources, if that's a tablet machine or a slate machine. So let's talk about some of the key scenarios. So the scenarios that we've seen, and we learned a lot in our pre-planning by talking to our field, talking to customers, and we saw a lot of interest in this scenario in a variety of different places. So one of them is working from home. And the scenario that really kicked this off when we were first looking at this problem was, if people remember the big snowstorm in D.C. a couple years ago, where there was over 150,000 people, federal people, out of work for a week and a half, and they said the cost of that was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million of lost time and lost work. One of the scenarios there is to issue people a drive that they can take and use in the case of emergency. You could imagine providing this to users, not necessarily instead of a laptop, because you'll always have some users in the organization that need a laptop, but you could imagine organizations looking at a portfolio strategy where they give some users laptops, they give some users Windows to Go workspaces, and maybe use virtualization for some of the others. Again, managed experience on an unmanaged device, no need to install any software on the user's home machine and incur potential support calls that might ensue from that. Another scenario that we got, and this was largely talking to some of our, what we call our desktop advisory committee, some very large customers for Microsoft that we work with through the cycle, was the contractor scenario. So more and more you're seeing companies bring in vendors and contractors, and those vendors and contractors are often bringing their own machine. And so this is a great way to give them a managed desktop, very, very straightforward. They don't have to install any software, reconfigure network, so that they can essentially be immediately productive, and you don't have to incur the cost of giving them or letting them use a machine while they're in your environment or while they're in the corporate environment. The last scenario that I'll talk briefly about, shared PCs. This is actually has some really cool underlying scenarios that we heard about firsthand. So the idea here is that you've got machines that are shared among a number of different individuals, and you'll see this in hoteling scenarios where organizations will set up satellite offices and people can come in and use those for the day. But you also see this in a number of other really interesting scenarios. See it in embedded laptops in vehicles. So police officers increasingly have full-on embedded laptops in their machines. We've seen and talked to different organizations that want to issue USB drives to the officers. The officers get whatever car they get. They boot up off that. When they're done, they take the USB drive, they give it back. Same thing with scenarios like emergency response, where organizations like FEMA will mobilize in a disaster scenario. They want to be able to have laptops. Well, if those laptops are sitting dormant, they may not be patched. They want to get them out. They also have potential opportunity to get lost or stolen or broken. In that scenario, you just give drives to the people that are needed on site, and then if a laptop gets broken or stolen, they can just use another machine, and they're fine. So these are the scenarios, and I walk through this because one of the things I want you to leave with is, even though that we're targeting this to enterprises, we've seen a lot of really interesting support across a lot of scenarios. So we really are coming into this, and one of the reasons why we did this in Windows 8, because we've certainly looked at this scenario before in different versions of Windows, but we really felt the demand was right, and that there was an overwhelming opportunity here to start and provide a new set of scenarios. And then, of course, people like you here, providing the supporting partner ecosystem with drives, et cetera, that are actually going to be able to support this scenario. So let me go into kind of the meat of the presentation, which is really the depth and what we had to do and some of the considerations. So we'll talk about booting over USB, That's a whole new scenario for us. Roaming to multiple PCs, there are a lot of interesting challenges there. The fact that this boot disk is outside the plastic, if you will, it's external, and we'll talk a bit about provisioning and deployment. So we did a bunch of work on the USB stack to support boot. It was certainly possible, and anybody who really tried hard enough could make Windows 7 or even previous versions of Windows boot over USB. However, there were a number of things that were missing to really make that experience supportable from our perspective. So we didn't have support for things like paging, and certainly that's important when you're dealing with limited memory environments. So we first added support for booting and making the drivers boot start so you can actually use USB to boot. And this is an important thing to point out, is booting from USB is interesting not just for Windows to Go, but it's also something that we see happening over the long haul in PCs in general. With the speed and performance and power utilization of USB 3, we expect that in the next few years a number of PCs will come with native USB boot built in as the standard bus, even on low power devices, because you could have just USB and you could power external devices as well as the internal devices. So our team that built this particular offering, Windows to Go, also worked on the work around making USB 2.0 and 3.0 boot. So one thing, before I go through the other two, something that's really important is distinguishing the USB 3.0 and 2.0 stacks. So we've done the work in both. So Windows 7 obviously didn't have a Windows 3.0 stack, but we've done the work in both the 2.0 stack and the new 3.0 stack so that Windows to Go will work on legacy machines that are out there. And as you saw, I'm running all three of these machines that I'm going to demo on are all running USB 2. But USB 3, of course, is much faster, and the experience is, the boot experience is about twice as fast on boot. And when you're running from a USB 3 on a USB 3.0 drive, the experience is very, very fast. But important here to understand that we did both. So we also did a bunch of work around power management, Standby and Hibernate. So they're both supported, though depending on the type of scenario, whether or not you're roaming, really dictates whether or not you want to use things like Standby and Hibernate. We have Hibernate turned off by default, and especially if you're roaming from one machine to another. For instance, you can't Hibernate, yank out the drive, and then go and plug the drive in and expect to unhibernate on another machine. So that's not something that's supported, and one of the reasons why we turn that off by default. We've also added crash dump support, so we have better ability to diagnose problems and issues. So it really is a first-class stack now in Windows. Roaming. This has been another issue that in the past you would have come into problems when you roam from one machine to another. What we've done here is we've enabled the ability to go to a PC. We identify that PC uniquely through the firmware. We then enumerate all the drivers and devices for that machine. And if you roam to another machine, we determine that that's a new machine, and we go through the same process. The first time you roam to a new machine, you'll see Windows put up a screen saying it's discovering the devices. After you've done that one time, when you roam back to any machine that you've ever been to, the speed is very fast. In fact, it boots very, very quickly. The important thing, though, is that you don't get into an issue where you've got the same drive or the same device on two different machines, possibly configured differently, and then you could crash because the system doesn't understand that the machines are fundamentally different. We do uniquely identify each machine so that we make roaming a very robust and fast experience. I don't know if people attended some of the device sessions, but we've done a bunch of work in plug and play to actually make that enumeration of devices very, very fast. So the first run is very quick. We've also added a lot of drives and a lot of drivers to Windows 8. So one of the things you'll see is that most of what you would have on a machine will be found in box. And then if you don't have a particular driver, we use Windows Update to bring those down. So that's what we do for roaming. One of the things that's new, and it's interesting that we came out with this feature at a time where, for the first time ever, firmware, which has been BIOS for the last 25 years, is finally changing. Now, this isn't really a problem for, in fact, this is a pretty unremarkable issue for Windows in general. You just get all the new benefits of UEFI. However, for Windows to Go, it's actually quite a challenging issue for us that we solved, which was, well, how do you actually roam from one firmware type to another? And this was something we spent a lot of time thinking about, because today, you'd never see that problem. 99% of machines that you would encounter are either running legacy BIOS or they're running UEFI in legacy BIOS mode. However, going forward, you will start to see more Type 3 systems which are running native UEFI. We actually enabled this scenario by putting both sets of boot components in the system partition, so that you can actually create a firmware roamable. In fact, that's our default deployment. You create a firmware roamable deployment where you can move from a legacy BIOS machine to a UEFI machine, and it's completely transparent. So the good news is for users who would never know if their system is UEFI or legacy BIOS, it's just not something that they have to worry about, but it is something that we spent a lot of design time on and took a lot of thought to come up with this. Probably one of the most challenging issues that we'll have with Windows to Go is actually, well, how do you boot to USB? Because some machines boot to USB, some machines you need to go into the firmware and you need to force the machine to boot USB. So it's a one-time change in the firmware, or there's a key sequence that you need to press, like F2, to get a boot menu. So for Windows 8, what we actually did was we added a feature that allows you to go into the control panel and tell Windows to boot off of a Windows to Go workspace if one is present. And we did that for both legacy BIOS and we did it for UEFI. So these are only on Windows 8 machines. This isn't something we went back and outfitted previous versions of Windows, but it's an applet that will live in control panel. IT pros can set it through policy, so they could turn it on or they could keep it off. But it is something that will really help in terms of usability. And we'll actually have a couple of slides that I'll show at the very end, because you're going to have to go through this experience yourself of changing your firmware settings if it doesn't boot from USB. So you'll get to experience this firsthand, though you won't have access to this feature. So in terms of deployment, it's deployed and managed just like Windows. And so all of our imaging capabilities that you would find, like ImageX, apply exactly the same way to Windows to Go. The only caveat that I would point out is that the roaming firmware option that I mentioned is something that is unique to Windows to Go. It's not really necessary for other versions of Windows that aren't going to roam. But aside from that, everything else is exactly like a normal Windows layout. If you look at when you get your Windows to Go workspace and you look at the disk layout on the drive, you'll see it's exactly like a normal copy of Windows. So the same tools that you would use to image a laptop, you can run a script, you'll be able to do with Windows to Go. Boot disk removal. So this is an interesting problem that you get into only when you have a drive that's running outside of the chassis. And one of the things that we looked at, especially because you've got different drives, some of them stick out, some of them don't fit quite as snugly into the USB port, and in general, users may not understand that if they pull the drive out of a running machine, it's equivalent to reaching into a desktop machine and yanking out the hard drive. Maybe not quite as difficult, but it's the same impact. And so we spent some time looking at this, and we actually came up with a pretty clever way to freeze the operating system, just like a kernel debugger, when you remove the drive, and we'll freeze it, and we'll freeze it for up to a minute. We could go longer. The reason we chose a minute was because everything on screen is essentially there to see. So you could be in a situation where you've got documents or other things that you may not want people to see. But for up to a minute, we'll freeze the operating system, and then we'll shut down. And so I've actually got a demo of that. So let me bring that one up here. And so on this machine, I've got an important document that I'm working on, and I've got a video. And it's probably easier to show you this running a video because you can actually see the movement of the video. So you can see this video. So then I'm going to pull this out. And this is a Kingston drive, and it's fully out of the machine. And I can put it back in the machine, and we'll resume right from where we were. So that's... And that was Arvind and his team. We had many different ways to do that, actually, more than you would think. And it was one of those really interesting design processes where you get a lot of engineers in a room and you get a lot of good discussion. So let me come back to the PowerPoint here. So let's talk about partner opportunities, because one of the things I mentioned at the outset was that, Windows to Go, I briefly alluded to the fact that the drives that are out there, weren't designed for this sort of scenario. And certainly anybody who's spent any time looking at USB flash drives know that the main scenario for drives, to this point has really been copying files, copying pictures or music files. And so those really map to sequential writes. Fast drives are drives that are able to copy and read files very quickly. What we need for Windows to Go, because we're really running Windows off of a drive, is we need something that has the same characteristics of a drive you would see inside the machine. And what that really is an SSD. We're really looking for USB 3.0 drives that have the characteristics of an SSD in a form factor that's more portable. And we've worked with a number of drive makers, SuperTalent and Kingston. We've also worked with Western Digital. And one thing that I should point out is that when I said that drives that are similar to drives that are inside the machine, spinning drives actually work very well. In fact, you could take a USB 2.0 external drive that you might have now, and Windows to Go will work just fine on that scenario. However, going forward, because we think the people will want more portable drives, is that for flash drives in particular, we will have a certification program. We already have a USB 3.0 certification program. And what's really different between what we're looking for and what it would take to simply pass the USB 3.0 logo program would be that, one, the drives are fast. They specialize in more random read writes with low latency. But probably the biggest difference is on the reliability, and there we will want a 2-year minimum expected life, because Windows, when it runs from these drives, even the file system at idle, you're putting a lot, you're writing a lot of very small, reading and writing a lot of very small files, and so you really need a controller that's high quality, and you need high quality flash. That's from a device side. It's not just limited to that, though. Also, when we look at machines that are out there, there are a few things that we found we need. Now, 3.0 support is desirable. It certainly doesn't exist on most machines that are out there. But going forward, I think the user experience will be much enhanced by running from USB 3. The other thing that's actually a little more nuanced is this notion of the external USB port and how many levels of hubs are there between the root port and the actual external USB port itself. And we have found that there are some machines where you end up with many, many internal hubs, and so the quality goes down because there's latency. So one of the things there we'd like to work with our OEM partners on trying to minimize that depth so that we can have a higher quality experience. Firmware that supports reliable USB boot. So again, this is most firmware systems do support it. It can be more complex and difficult in some than others, but that's again something we've been working with a number of the firmware vendors to keep that simple. And the last one, which is really about our ability to launch from USB, has to do with adding a class entry to UEFI, because that's actually how we do it. And so, again, that's something that we've been working with some of the firmware vendors on to make sure that that's something that can happen. So to recap, leave this session understanding that this is really targeted at enterprises. We know there's some really interesting enthusiast scenarios, and we've certainly heard a lot of that, but this was really designed in its first go to be targeted at enterprises. There are some new opportunities here. We think that the drive is really a new class of drive. And it's not necessarily a drive that anyone's going to want simply to use as a file caddy. So there's new opportunities here to create a new class of drives, and these drives will be, likely purchased in bulk by enterprises. So there's clearly some good financial opportunity here. We need systems that can reliably support USB boot, and we talked a little bit about that. And so that's really, what we'd like to leave you with here. There's a couple things I'd like to do before we get into the question and answer and then distribution of the drives themselves. I actually have a couple slides that get to an FAQ about the drives, and I'm not really interested in going through them, but since this session is recorded, if we can get the FAQ slides up there, then if you have questions yourselves, you can go through, you can watch the video, you can freeze the slide. Let me quickly just bring those up. Talks about how to boot from USB. These are some just general questions that you might have. And certainly some people will have machines that don't boot easily, and we'll be at the booth, so we definitely encourage you to come. In fact, we're really interested now in understanding if there are machines that are out there that don't boot correctly. We're at the phase of the project where these are some of the types of issues that we work on, and typically it tends to be a firmware issue, and then it allows us to go back and talk to some of the firmware vendors. So let me quickly come back to some basic things related to the handout. So one of the things I mentioned was you're going to have to boot from USB. Some laptops will automatically boot from USB. Most, though, you need to go in yourself, and you can either do it one time with a hotkey sequence, or you can go, I would recommend going into the firmware settings and moving your USB up to the top, because typically you'll go through, you'll boot up, you may need to reboot depending on the type of drivers that were installed, video drivers, so it might be more than one. And the last thing is about shutdown. Definitely, you want to shut down if you're going to roam to another machine. Of course, you can yank the drive out if you're done with it, but I wouldn't advise that as the way you do it on a normal basis, especially if you're going to go and boot up on another machine. So with that, I'd like to bring up Arvind and invite questions. I know we've gotten a lot of questions at the booth, and again, I'll reiterate that before we leave and give out the drives, if you have questions, please see us at the booth. We have a bunch of people who can answer questions. And if in some cases, if the drive is bad, which can happen occasionally, we have drives that we can replace. The other thing I would say is we have limited number of drives. We're giving them out to this audience, so we're not giving them out to everyone at the session. So be respectful and mindful of that, and don't walk around showing your drives. So. I'm sorry, I didn't totally get your question. Do you want to, is your question about ensuring that you can't modify the USB drive?
I want to protect the USB stick. So if the user does something, so think about a kiosk mode. Somebody, it should always run the same way like I designed my user interface. So can I protect the USB stick that the user is not able to store something back on the USB stick?
So the question is, can I ensure that essentially the user can't write any user data back to the drive itself? We didn't talk about encryption, which was something that I left out because we actually have BitLocker support, but that doesn't directly address your question. We can't make everything read-only because we make a number of writes. The operating system makes a number of writes. I don't know, do you have a good answer for that, Arvind?
Steve actually clearly identified the operating system. Even for booting, actually, we do a bunch of writes, and we can't really boot off a read-only disk. So unlike WinPE, which is a RAM disk, so one of the ways actually would be actually following an approach like WinPE. But full Windows is actually right now, today, does not support RAM disk. So what you're saying actually is not possible using full Windows. You can do actually what you're saying using WinPE, Windows Padole environment, but again, it doesn't have full capabilities.
Okay, so the second question, what is the minimum requirement from your point of view, roughly, about the size of the USB drive?
Oh, good question. That's something I should have covered. So the question was, what's the minimum size of the drive? Well, right now, we're looking at a 32 gig minimum size, and that's largely because when you look at the size of the operating system, applications, and user data, and a page file, you could certainly squeeze down below that, but that's going to be our recommended size. We also think that the price of the drives will be such that that will be a...
Exactly the next question, are there tools that you can scale it?
Excuse me?
Well, if I want to save money for the USB stick, so let's say my application should run a 4 gig USB stick or 8 gig, can I scale it?
Not with full Windows, you can't. We have Windows Embedded, which is more designed for taking components out, but we don't have a model. Because minimum footprint for Windows, because we need to have the drivers essentially so that it can roam from machine to machine.
Windows 8 embedded?
Possibly. I mean, they haven't. They've actually done Windows 7 Embedded has actually worked with a few vendors.
And last question. Is the license on the CPU or on the stick?
So that's a great. I knew that question was going to come up. We aren't talking about licensing yet. So except to say that it's an enterprise feature. So you got me on a few of those. Good questions. Anyone else? Yeah.
Could you prep the USB stick to have a VHD image?
So the question is, could you prep the USB stick to have a VHD image? Well, you can certainly run Windows on VHD off of a USB stick. That's certainly possible. We looked at that as one of the possible ways that we were going to run, but there's some limitations. You can't use BitLocker, for instance, on a VHD. But there's nothing stopping you from running a VHD.
Boot from VHD actually from USB key works fine, but all the toolkit that we have will only use the native image.
So you showed the ImageX apply command, and you said you turned off Hibernate. What are the steps that you used, and is that documented?
Absolutely. The question was, we showed using ImageX, and yet at the same time we turn off Hibernate. You want to talk
Right.
about that?
So the hibernation turning off actually is done automatically, so you don't need to do anything while doing the ImageX. So when Windows boots up, it knows that it is booting from USB and it's an external drive, so we turn off Hibernate automatically. So there is no additional step you need to do.
How about-
I was just throwing that out. One of the things that you're doing, are there a group or a specific steps that you're taking that are documented and help us?
Yes, so there will be actually, so we try to minimize those steps, and there are only a couple of steps that you would need to take, and all those will be documented in the deployment guide. So one step is actually to set the storage policy where you need to offline the internal drive. So that's one step, and that's already an existing command today that you can do as part of the deployment. And the other one is actually doing the same thing on the USB key, which is setting the partition attributes to hide the USB partitions when it is plugged in as a data drive. So those two steps are the only things. We really tried hard to actually minimize those steps so that the deployment remains same.
So following same thought is that you can have, for example, a 64 gig USB drive and half for the Windows to go, the other half for as a share.
Say that again?
So you can have, for example, a 64 gig USB drive that half of the 32 gig as a Windows to go drive, the other half as a share drive. So it's visible both to the native Windows 8 on the host machine as well as to the
Yeah, so you can do
Repeat the
that kind of
question.
configuration. So, sorry. Yeah, so the question was, can I partition the drives into two different partitions and hide one partition as a Windows 2 Go drive and keep the other partition free so that it can be visible on other computers? So there are two different disk layouts that we have. One is the MBR format, another one is the GPT. So the attribute that we are using actually on MBR, that is applicable to all the partitions. If you set that attribute, all partitions are hidden.
So similarly, can you have two Windows to go sessions on one single drive?
One
Single physical USB drive but with two different images on it.
Like dual boot?
yes, you can.
So I can select which one I want to boot. For
Yes,
example,
you
one
can.
for the
Yeah,
Office
you can
boot.
do all those. Yeah, anything that you can do as dual boot configuration, you can do that.
Yeah, so the question was, could you dual boot off of a Windows to go drive? And the answer is yes,
Right.
yes you can. So
Okay, so that'd be like an ARM one and then a Windows one on the same drive.
well, let's not go into that. I didn't say that. Yeah, that gets into whether or not Windows to go will work on ARM, which isn't something
Okay.
we're ready to talk about.
My actual question is, what is the limitations on what devices that you have access to when using the Windows to go? Like, you probably can't do firmware updates and things like that from it, or are there any limitations at all, like what storage devices and such?
So the question is, what limitations would you have on, I'm assuming you're talking about host resources and things that would apply to the host relative to, so let me take the easy part first, which is any of the devices, the physical devices that are available on the host can be made available to Windows to go. So I showed you that it was offline when we first booted up. Now Arvind just mentioned that that's a deployment step, so you could decide not to do that. We've also added a new storage policy, which is we offline the disk, the host drive that's running Windows on the host, but anything you add to it afterwards, like a USB drive or an external drive, we actually see. You can play around with those, so you do get full access. As long as you have the drivers, you get full access to any of those resources, printers, etc. As far as doing a firmware update from a Windows to go drive.
Right. So basically, actually, in fact, whatever you can do on Windows today, you can do everything on Windows to go.
Okay.
There is really no limitations as such. So you can do firmware update also.
I have a couple questions. One, is it configurable the amount of time that it will suspend if you pull it out? So can you make it like 5 seconds or make it 2 minutes?
So the question is on the surprise removal, or can we configure that to different times other than the 1 minute? And the answer is yes, we can change that time period. We actually, when we started this feature and we spec'd it, we thought about having a settable interval. And this has actually been something that we've been trying to understand from customers, because depending on who you talk to, you know, a minute's too long or a minute's not long enough. And so it's something that we'll continue to look at, and we're looking to get feedback on it. But as was pointed out, the main reason why we don't go more than a minute is you could have a security scenario where you've got documents up on the machine. We can't paint the screen and come back. We can paint the screen, but then we can't do anything to bring back what was there. So that was one of our limitations that we were working with. So
I'm more concerned that a minute's way too long.
yeah,
More
I
like
mean,
5
we
seconds.
may decide that a minute is too long, and we'll need to change that, and we'll have, you know, the next period in beta to get feedback from users on that.
And then can you boot it up off of USB in a virtual machine?
So the question is, can you boot off the Windows to Go drive in a virtual machine? If you have a virtualization software that provides the native USB support, you can do that because it's pretty much like a regular machine. But if you're talking about something like Hyper-V or Virtual PC, these products don't have native USB support, so you can't do that. They have synthetic USB support, where you need an operating system inside a virtual machine before you can access a USB device.
Okay.
And so for that reason, you can't really boot, because you need the USB disk access at the firmware level to boot the machine.
Thank you.
So I had an answer for the first gentleman and then a question for you. If you want to boot off from what you said, since you can boot off VHD, as you normally can, on a USB stick, it's fairly simple to create your build, create a child disk, a differencing disk, boot off the differencing disk, and then it's fairly simple to just wipe it when you reboot. You can see an example of that I put up on a site, www.steadierstate.com, and I've got step-by-steps on how to do that stuff. So if you want, whoever it was, if you want to try that, that'll probably help you. My question was, where are you putting the page file? Are you putting the page file on the local hard drive, or are you putting it on the USB stick?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
I'm sorry. So where are you putting the page file?
Oh.
Are you putting it on the USB stick, or
Right.
are you just using the local hard drive?
Great question. So the question is, where's the page file? So the page file is actually on the USB stick. We didn't want to leave anything. Now you could go in and change that if you wanted to, you know,
Sure.
unhide the host and do that. But the reason we did this was to leave no artifacts behind. So and
Makes
that
sense.
was
The security issue.
yeah.
Thank you.
So you mentioned encrypting hard drive. Does Windows to Go support encrypting hard drive? And if so, can you elaborate on that?
I'm sorry. The
You
echo.
mentioned encrypting hard drive.
Right.
Does Windows to Go support encrypting hard drive? And if so, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so great question. Does Windows to Go support encrypting hard drive? So there's a few, let me spend a couple minutes just talking about encryption in general, because I skipped over that. There was a bullet in there that talked. So one of the things we did with Windows to Go was we added a password key protector for BitLocker that is a full-on password that is not tied to a TPM. So you can BitLocker the drive, you can provide a password inside an organization. Group policy can enforce the complexity of that password. You can move from machine to machine, and you'll work just fine. As far as encrypted drives, eDrive support goes, it is possible to use eDrive, although in that scenario you need native UEFI, and you need native UEFI to be on all the machines that you're roaming to. So that's probably something we should talk about more in depth, maybe back at the, out on the floor. But it's certainly possible. And the other thing I'll talk about at encryption is that we fully expect, now that we're going to be working with more hardware partners, to be working with those partners that actually specialize in hardware-based encryption, because we see that certainly in some scenarios, software encryption alone won't meet the requirements, and someone will want a deeper level of encryption. So the quick answer is yes, but we should talk more offline about that if you want to get more details.
Yeah, I had a question about like more or less the user taking this home, somehow downloading a virus to it. Are we allowed to run some type of antivirus on these drives, or should we not do that?
So the question is, yes, should you run antivirus on Windows to Go? And we fully expect that people will. We've been using it that way ourselves. So the same antivirus that an organization, so the same corporate image that someone would have inside their enterprise would be the same image that they would run on Windows to Go, and that way you could ensure that your users, I mean, that's another value prop of working from home, is that you don't know that the user is running antivirus software at home and that it's up to the state that you need it. So yes, you would be running that on Windows to Go.
And how would you actually, I don't know if the tablet version of this operating system we have allows us to do it, but how do you make one of these disks in the enterprise?
How do you make a Windows to Go workspace? So we showed you a simple script, and I believe there's already scripts up on a couple of the blogs. So the same way that you would image a desktop or laptop machine using something like ImageX would be how you would create a Windows to Go workspace, or you could take one that you already had and duplicate it. But eventually, you probably saw some of the blog posts that showed a utility, but that wasn't something that's in this build of Windows. But it is something that's very easily scripted with a very short script, and most likely you'll see that up on the web here very soon.
Okay, hopefully an easy question. What about Windows Update?
So Windows Update works exactly, the question is about Windows Update, and Windows Update works exactly the same on Windows to Go as it would work on a normal. In fact, it's very likely that any machine that you might have will require some drivers that you would get from Windows Update, and it will bring those down as needed. So.
What about servicing the image once I've got the USB sticks out in the enterprise? If I want to make some change to the image, do I have to get them back, or is there a way to like use group policy or direct access to stream something out to them?
Great question. So how do you service these drives once they're out in the wild? And the short answer is you would service them exactly like you would service a laptop. So you could use group policy, you could use any of the software distribution mechanisms, but essentially group policy would be the way that you would, especially if you change policy and things, anytime they log into the network, they're going to get policy pushed down to them exactly the same way that a laptop would. So just think of them exactly like a laptop. And some of the same challenges that come with a laptop if you haven't logged on in a very long period of time would also apply to a Windows to Go workspace. So that's something that you need, that IT pros need to consider. They don't want these things sitting dormant for a very, very long time, and the machine might have gotten, the machine account might have gotten destroyed. So,
if you guys can do this for USB key, what's keeping you guys to do it for past SD card?
From what? I'm sorry.
For the SD card.
Oh, okay, great question. So the question is, this all works for USB, what about SD? And there's kind of two parts to that. One of the biggest issues that we've seen with SD is just the speed and resiliency of the flash itself. And so on one hand, you could certainly take a USB card that has, or a SD card that has a USB interface, and you could try that. The reality is that we just haven't yet seen SD flash that's robust enough to run Windows, but you could run it that way. We looked at whether or not, when we first started this project, there's certainly advantages of SD. You don't get the problem of it sticking out of the machine because it's nicely recessed. But when we looked at and surveyed how many machines have SD versus USB, it was kind of a no-brainer decision for us. But my guess is over time, as SD gets more powerful and more robust, you could do it via USB, dongle connection.
Hey Steve, two quick questions for you. What's the failure mode after the 60 seconds has elapsed? So you pull out the drive and you avoided a blue screen, I imagine, by plugging it back in.
Right.
Well, what happens if you didn't? Both on the drive side for the image, will it rebuild? And for the machine side, the machine you left stranded.
Right. So the question is, yeah, you don't get it back in 60 seconds. You drop the key, or you fumble, or it's in a knapsack and you pull it out. So we do a shutdown. We power the machine down. As far as the state of the drive itself and the machine, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it is like a abrupt removal of the boot disk, so you can have disk corruption, depending on what state actually operating system was at the time actually you pulled out the drive. So it is really, the surprise removal mitigation is really for all the emergency scenarios where you accidentally plug it out. It's not really for, okay, I'm done and just take it out and go. In fact, it can cause corruption on the disk if you don't plug it in.
But as far as the host machine...
Yeah, so host machine actually just turns off,
yeah.
so there is really no damage on the host machine.
Okay, just really quick, you mentioned there was a control panel applet in Windows 8 that would enable you to do the boot. Could you show us where that is?
Well, I could show it to you, but we actually took it out for this conference, again, because this is... the question is, can you see the control panel applet? And the short answer is not yet. It's a very simple applet. I can describe it to you. Troy actually designed it, and it literally has two radio buttons, one of which says boot from a Windows to Go workspace if one is present. And like I said, it can be turned on and off by group policy, but it's not in the builds that you guys have right now. You'll see it eventually.
Can you also use an external USB hard drive?
Great question. Can you use an external USB hard drive? The answer is an emphatic yes. In fact, you can use any 2.0 spinning drive, assuming that it's reasonably fast, but any of the drives that you would get today from Western Digital or Seagate are certainly fast enough and robust enough. You can use those as well. And they, to the degree that they're fast enough to run Windows, they should work just fine, even over USB 2. Any other questions? Okay, well now the fun starts. And it looks like we're outside the room.
So, everyone, hold on. Don't go anywhere. I want to make sure everyone gets a drive. I want to make sure everyone gets one drive. There are plenty of drives, so no one needs to worry. Please don't trample me. So we're going to do this. What we're going to do is we're going to shut that door. So all the folks that actually saw the presentation, and if we could just shut those doors. We're all friends. Everybody's a friend. All right. So there's going to be a couple of us standing at that door, and we're just going to hand the drives to you as you come out. So if you have questions for Steve or Arvind, feel free to ask questions. We're going to be at the booth as well. We're going to hand out one drive to everybody at that door in 30 seconds. Give me a second.
Thank you very much.